Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 18 cheat sheet, and for me the two pressing concerns this week are what to do with the forwards and the kind of impending threat of Mitrovic, including that Game Week 19 double that he has, and then also how to address Reece James, which I've also talked about briefly in my team selection video. But widerly speaking, I think just what the defensive landscape is going to be and how we should move into, let's say, addressing that third defensive position in your FPL teams. As far as the midfield, if we start with that as usual, Andreas for me is still a top pick in the budget territory. But then if we actually move towards the 5 to 5.9 assets, I think there has been a bit of a change here with the Brighton midfielders. And I have to suggest that Gross and McAllister are not that interesting because, first of all, McAllister is still going to be eased in after winning the World Cup. As far as Gross, I really don't think he's been playing such a pivotal role under De Zerbi when compared to under Potter. And that's the key thing. Who has been doing well under Brighton for De Zerbi? And I think it's actually Mitoma and March that are the most interesting assets. March, of course, is a very obvious pick to suggest because he just absolutely did incredible in the previous game. However, Mitoma was actually the player who got the most expected goals, the most threat there, and actually had 4 shots. Much more than any other player in that Brighton team. So I think Mitoma is actually the hidden pick and the hidden gem for this Brighton team if you'd like to capitalize on them in the future. The reality is that they have an Arsenal fixture next in Game Week 18, so I don't really see the point in going for a Brighton player here, but it's more about understanding and trying to build an understanding of this Brighton team and how to actually tackle the double Game Week fixtures in the future, because when you also look at this team under De Zerbi, the lack of clean sheets is very apparent, but they have somehow transformed into a much more clinical attacking team, and I think that's the value of the Brighton midfielder in the future. As far as the 6 to 6.9 assets, I've moved Trossard there into the 7.X territory because he's of course much higher priced there. But you now have 3 absolutely god tier picks in Rashford, Martinelli, and Odegaard, and I think there's a genuine discussion to maybe even question whether Odegaard is a better asset than Martinelli. But because we've built so much value in Martinelli, why not even extend your triple Arsenal ownership into just simply being the triple midfielders? I think there's more value there than potentially going for a double Arsenal attack and a defender. I've actually personally gone for that second structure there where I have Ben White in my team. But if you have the capacity to move into a 3-5-2 template and you don't already have an Arsenal defender, I think there is some value to say that you could move into Odegaard as well and try to squeeze him into your team. My logic for this is that if you just include any of the players from the 7 to 8 territory and you simply just bake in these kind of 6.x picks and just go for players like Rashford, Martinelli, Odegaard, or even Almiron, who's much cheaper, you can still squeeze a fantastic team. So those 4 players plus a Salah plus a De Bruyne seem to be what could create a fantastic template, because that also might even allow you to push into Kane from that Darwin spot that we all have in FPL. And if you go for a 3-5-2 template, you can also save money by going into Greenwood. So that's the possibilities that we have at play. And you could obviously upgrade some of the defenders into someone like a great punt like a Robertson or a Trent in the future. As far as the 7.x territory, I had to absolutely drop Zaha and Trossard. Trossard was dropped only 1 tier, whereas Zaha was dropped 2. And we talked about how Zaha had 2 great fixtures right off the bat in Game Week 17 with Fulham and then Bournemouth on the bounce. But I really think that this Crystal Palace team just don't look that interesting overall because the overall attacking ceiling is quite low. And even though Zaha is one of the penalty takers in this team, as I said, there's just much more value from other teams in that kind of 4th to 6th spot competing for that Champions League territory that are more interesting as an overall cohesive unit within United, within Arsenal, within Newcastle. Obviously, Arsenal and Newcastle are doing a little bit better than 4th to 6th, but those are kind of my thoughts right now. As far as Mount, he's got an impending double, nothing to really worry about. Still a great pick, and he's got Nottingham Forest to play. Obviously, he scored outside the box, so I wouldn't say that was a fluke goal, but it didn't really suggest that he's going to get into the best positions. I still think Sterling and Havertz are the most lethal when it comes to that. So I wouldn't say try to apply too much hindsight bias over Mount. I think he's still not exactly one of the best picks, but just simply because the fixtures are so good, he still remains as a top asset. And then I've also dropped Trossard, as I mentioned, simply because I don't think he's been that effective in the system. I think he does, of course, play in a very advanced position, but as we've seen time and time again, when you have let's say a football team setup, it's not always the forwards who actually benefit the most. We've most often actually gotten the most value from midfielders, and I don't think it really matters too much where you play in the pitch. We've seen some wingers who've done incredible in FPL, and I think Trossard is one of those examples where you don't have to squeeze that much money to just cover this Brighton team and capture, let's say, the forward there. Welbeck is a great example of someone who's played there in that position countless amount of times for Brighton and done absolutely nothing. So I think just because there's so much value in Mitoma and March in the future, Trossard has to fall as well to kind of match that. As far as the 8.x territory, I had to drop Foden, unfortunately. And I've been a Foden owner in the past, someone who's been bitten by Foden, someone who also wanted to go into Foden when he actually had that hat-trick versus Man United, but I actually sided with Saka at the time. And now we've got enough data in the season where we can clearly see that Saka continues to play consistent minutes, is also going to play a very pivotal role with Jesus out now, especially in the advanced areas in the attacking third and hopefully getting penalties, whereas Foden is someone who just doesn't interest whatsoever because he's unfortunately been benched 4 out of 5 times in the previous games. We can clearly see that Jack Grealish is also building a lot of form for the City team, even though some people clearly can see that he might be a little bit more limited in the overall technical aspect of his play right now in the City team. But I think there has to be some argument to why Pep is benching Foden as consistently as he is, and he just has to fall as a result. The expected minutes are too low, and unfortunately, even though he might have a fantastic game versus Everton, I'd still be worried about his possibilities of starting in Chelsea and Man United and going forwards when you have Champions League games in the future. So really, I think Foden has to drop into that second tier. And Kulusevski is someone that I mentioned wasn't too interesting anyways. I actually have to drop Maddison, however, because he's the least interesting asset. This Leicester team do look very, very dire, and you're not really going to consider him as a pick until that Fulham game comes around. So for me, Maddison, unfortunately, also with the kind of injury issue, I'm not really exactly sure what the context of that is or the full context of that is, but he has to drop. And then with the full premiums, you have De Bruyne, Salah, Fernandes, Sterling. I think that De Bruyne is someone that has to stay at the top. I thought he had a fantastic game versus Leeds. Yes, of course, he blanked, and he was one of the only midfielders in this week in Game Week 17 to blank. But I still think he had a fantastic game. And there are other games where, for example, if you look at the Odegaard game and what he brought to the table for this Arsenal team in Game Week 17, 2 assists and then 3 bonus points because he was such an effective chance creator. And these are the type of games that Kevin De Bruyne can easily have anytime when he plays for Man City. So I really think that there's not enough to just suggest that De Bruyne is completely worse than Salah immediately. I think, yes, of course, Salah is the better pick right now. And I myself, as a KDB owner, will probably say I'm feeling pretty regretful about it. But would I say Kevin De Bruyne is an immediate sell? Is he someone who doesn't belong in that tier 1 territory? I wouldn't say so. He also has an impending double, and based on that, we can obviously make a decision on whether we'd like to go into Salah, because we'll also get some future news about the Liverpool-Chelsea potential double game week fixture in 20. But until that happens, I really think Kevin De Bruyne is probably still a pick that you'd like to keep, and you wouldn't want to move that transfer into Salah until at least game week 19. As far as Fernandes and Sterling, I have to just drop Fernandes, even though I thought he had a relatively great half versus Nottingham Forest in Game Week 17, and that's simply just because his role for the team has changed. I think he's doing a lot more on the defensive end as well, and he's also being a much more distributive player, a much more creative player right now, and he's kind of playing that role that Eriksen also plays for this United team, where he is going to be a cog to the system and actually supplying some of the forwards. And I just think Fernandes has to drop. He's clearly overvalued based on historical precedents and what he's done in the future, in the past, but I don't think we're going to see a 200-point season, even if United were constantly winning each game with Fernandes. That's simply the picture of how this team plays with him, and he has to drop as a result. Sterling's still interesting because of the short-term strength of his fixtures and that double game week simply. Moving on to the forwards, I feel like we're now in a position where we have some great players in the forward positions, and once again, some great assets in the budget territory. And I've already risen Nketiah towards the top tier because I feel like I've made a mistake in terms of undervaluating him as an asset and simply just once again being so surprised at how good this Arsenal team is. Yes, I don't think Nketiah is as good as Jesus as an asset, but he clearly is priced well in this game. So I think in the context of seeing players like Marcel Mitrovic, even though they seem like great assets themselves, I just can't see any value being lost by going into Nketiah, specifically when we've just seen another Darwin performance where he was very chaotic and potentially could have had 2 to 3 goals in that game, but also ended up with the classic Darwin performance of getting 0. I think Darwin is someone who we know has high highs and low lows, and simply put, as I said, it's probably one of those assets you want to gamble upon, whereas players like Nketiah and Martial probably a little bit better at taking their chances, to be quite honest. As far as Mitrovic, though, I think he is still the absolute god tier asset in this territory, and I can completely understand people going from Martial to Mitrovic anyways in this area. But if you are someone who owns someone like Adams, I'd still be quite hesitant over whether he's going to work out as a punt. Yes, you've got the kind of full gambit here of great fixtures, and maybe you'd like to work with Adams and kind of give him at least the benefit of the doubt until the Nottingham Forest game. But we are now starting to approach a territory where teams like United, teams like Arsenal are just such well-oiled machines, and they have assets that are at such cheap prices. It's really hard to pass up on them. In my opinion, I think you should probably try to stick with your forwards and actually gut it out, because all of these players have had great fixtures and there's no real reason to move away from them. Solanke, for example, is someone that's only really worth consideration later on, maybe when that Brentford game comes along. And as far as Wilson, he has to fall in that kind of 7 to 8.9 tier, and Wilson falls simultaneously with Havertz's rise and reintroduction to the cheat sheet, because Havertz is now in a position where you've got great short-term value from someone like Havertz, and Wilson, unfortunately, based on the comments from Howe, it does seem like he needs a little bit of time to actually build, first of all, match fitness, but also even just the ability to actually start games anytime soon. So I actually think those were pretty damning comments about Wilson. If he's able to start versus Leeds and maybe just play 60 minutes, that could already be good enough, because we know this Leeds team haven't really shown much from the defensive point of view for us to be really worried about. But I'd probably be quite tempted to move from Wilson to Mitrovic, simply because that cost saving there could restructure your team quite well, could maybe allow you to push from, let's say, someone like James, if you can roll him this week, into someone like a Robertson or Trent, if you kind of find some value there as well. So I think that's quite interesting. As far as Darwin, I still think he's at 100% a top pick. Yes, he had the very classic performance that I think a lot of people would like to be quite critical of with Darwin, where he got so many great chances, once again built fantastic XG because of his own positioning, to be quite honest, and his own threats and strengths as the kind of athlete that he is. But I would say Darwin is one of those assets because he's already scored 5 goals this season, where you're going to expect these really poor games where he's going to miss a lot of big chances, but he's still getting enough chances and still converting around 25% of them for you to still consider him as a top pick, because this Liverpool team are creating some incredible amounts of expected goals, with the fullbacks once again firing back into what we've expected from at least the last 3 to 4 years, if we're being honest. So I think Darwin is, for me, one of the top picks, and I don't think Gakpo is going to change his minutes in the near future. We've actually seen some comments about how Gakpo will need time to actually build some match fitness. He also has been playing with PSV, and of course is fresh off the World Cup, so he might need some time to actually adjust towards the Jurgen Klopp system. We've always seen some new transfers coming towards Klopp's team and actually taking a bit of time to get started and to get firing. So for me, Darwin is still a pick that I wouldn't really avoid for now. Maybe you could reassess moving into something like Havertz in the next week in Game Week 19 if that seems appetizing. But do you need to force a transfer now? I think no, there's probably bigger fires in your team if you're worried about transferring Darwin out. As far as Haaland and Kane, still remain as some of the top assets in the game. Kane, just someone who seems to be inevitable, where another dull first half performance with Tottenham goes by, and then in the second half he manages to salvage it with a fantastic goal, whether it's a kind of header from a set piece or an open play, or he manages to crack a shot from distance. So I think Kane is still fantastic as an asset, and there's no real tough fixtures until that Arsenal game, but we also know that Kane has an incredibly impressive North London derby record anyway. So that's kind of the landscape of the forwards for me. Moving on to the defenders, what we now have is a clear delineation between Bueno and Patterson. I think in the previous game itself, between Wolves and Everton, we got a bit of an eye test of what the future is going to look like for Patterson and Bueno. I think for Patterson, you can clearly say that this Everton team are probably going to struggle to keep clean sheets. And then with Bueno, I think he's already under fire when it comes to rotation and the threat of some of his replacements coming in, such as Ryan Aitnouri actually scoring the last-minute winner in that game as a substitute for Bueno. So that's already the tricky situation with the really, really cheap budget defenders in FPL, and I think the only great assets are 4.7 plus, unless you go for someone like Botman. And you can clearly see Botman being included in my cheat sheet here in the 4.1 plus territory, where Botman is going to be a great rotation piece with any kind of Chelsea asset that you have. If you already have Cucurella, then he could be an interesting pick. If you are looking for a second Chelsea defender, I think might you cast your eyes towards someone like Azpilicueta, who has played quite a lot of minutes under Potter so far, specifically when Reece James is injured, and now, of course, the scenario has reoccurred, so you can clearly expect Azpilicueta to play a lot of minutes so far. Azpilicueta has unfortunately missed one game where Chelsea did play a back five structure with Sterling playing almost in a right wing back position, and that was the only game that he really missed out whilst Reece James was out. So I think, depending on what you think Potter will actually play in the future, maybe if he continues with his back four, I think it's very clear Azpilicueta will play right back. But if he plays a back five, then there is a chance he could be rotated. Whereas some people do think that Cucurella is a little bit more rotation-proof if he can play left center back, left wing back, and left back very comfortably for Potter. So that's kind of why Cucurella has risen towards one of the top assets, because I think he's going to be a little bit more fixture-proof until Chilwell comes in. Whereas with Azpilicueta, his strength directly lies with Reece James being injured. And I think Cucurella, unfortunately, doesn't have the best expected goal involvement stats, so I think Azpilicueta is a good enough short-term punt to opt for if you'd like to save a little bit of money in your team. And I might actually be considering him because I think he's got enough value within 18 and 19 to be more superior towards a role towards Ben White anyway. So with Ben White, I think this is the situation with FPL where he has really terrible fixtures on paper, but this Arsenal team are fantastic at stifling their opponents, and we already saw that within the West Ham game, with exception to that kind of one-off mistake that gave away the penalty. West Ham were actually subdued to 0.2 expected goals. That's very, very low, and it clearly shows the value of Arsenal. But of course, maybe you could argue that West Ham had been also missing some key players in Scamacca and Antonio. As far as Shaw, I think he remains the most ideal double-edged player here in this kind of price bracket, because when you're comparing to players like Walker, who doesn't really possess any kind of expected goal threat, and then you compare it to also assets like Dunk, who falls in the same camp, I think Shaw is the superior option here, where he actually unfortunately just has two bad fixtures in game weeks 20 and 21. However, Shaw can actually have some great long-term value. So if you're thinking about your team going beyond, let's say, game weeks 25 plus, I think Shaw could actually stay in your team and remain there as a top pick, because he's probably going to be the least rotation prone asset within United. We actually just saw him play left center back in the previous game, and I think he's going to play left wing back in other games, because after that Manchester United derby, you can actually see the minutes completely drastically change for Shaw and Malacia. So those two assets have actually gone in completely opposite directions since then. As far as Dunk, as I've been saying with the Brighton team, not really sure about their value of clean sheets. We've also seen Ben Crellin suggest that Brighton might not actually double until 23. So there is possibilities that Brighton clean sheet and the double game week strengths will elude you for a long, long time if you look at him as a replacement. Plus, he has Arsenal this week, so it makes it very, very hard to go into him. With Botman, you can actually double up on this Newcastle team, and I think he has a lot of value there. And then with Cucurella, I've risen him towards matching Gabriel, because Gabriel has some great expected goal threat. Cucurella doesn't, but he just has the fixtures over him. And then the biggest change has actually been this kind of top echelon of assets. With Reece James now being injured, you're now struggling to actually find a third place player in your team for this defensive position, because a lot of people now will probably be calling upon Ben White if they're actually holding the transfer this week, or have already moved towards someone like Mitrovic if that was a priority for them. Or they could be looking to actually save some money in the future and then upgrade into a player like Robertson, Alexander-Arnold, or Van Dijk. I think there is some value within the Liverpool team, specifically because the defenders always, as we know, provide some value with the expected goal threats that they can provide. But I still think you can look at that Liverpool game in Game Week 17. They're still giving away a considerable amount of chances. I'm not really confident in them and the amount of value that we have to place to them in FPL. Whereas someone like Cancelo, I still think he still holds a lot of value. Yes, of course, a little bit of a blip and a great example of Cancelo, quote unquote, being non-essential in Game Week 17 because he came off the bench and played 22 minutes to only get 1 point. But there's going to be great fixtures that Cancelo will have in the future, and I think I have more faith in this City team and their overall defense, the ability to get clean sheets, where Cancelo can actually thrive and get 3 bonus points in that structure, more so than Alexander-Arnold, Robertson, or Van Dijk having, once again, great offensive games. Because you can see, for example, Trent had a great game in Game Week 17, but what's the value there if he loses the clean sheet and he's doing so much creative and having so many creative involvements, but not actually getting anything out of it? So that's unfortunately the kind of picture that Trent, or the kind of box that Trent Alexander-Arnold is in, and I therefore think he doesn't have too much value. But because we have such slim options now in the defensive positions, and we have so much budget because the midfielder options and the forward options are so cheap from Arsenal and Newcastle, I still think you would actually go for one of these punts in the future. So Yes, a little bit contradictory what I'm saying, but I think you can stretch towards Liverpool if you'd like to go towards that direction and go for a punt, but know that it's a differential. The alternative, of course, is simply just banking into these 4.7 assets. Some of these players who play for United, for example, are great, and they pretty much mirror the value that some Arsenal and Newcastle assets have too. So if you want some kind of diversity in your teams, I think maybe going short is the way to go this week. Moving on to the goalkeepers, I actually don't think there's much discussion to be made over the goalkeepers. Maybe you could actually argue that Alisson should be reintroduced to the cheat sheet, but I'd probably say it's not worthwhile. You could maybe even suggest that Pope should be reintroduced because this Newcastle team is so strong. And I think these are valid arguments, but for now, I still think we have so much value in some of the cheaper assets that it's not really worth talking about because, first of all, you've got Kepa, Sanchez, and Leno. All of these assets did well. Sanchez managed a penalty save in a game where Southampton amassed something like 1.7 expected goals. Leno managed to get a clean sheet in a very easy game for him because, I mean, at one point, of course, Fulham were playing 9 versus 11. And then with Kepa, fantastic performance that actually allowed him to get bonus points and also save points too. So we are now in the kind of FPL territory where I think we're just getting too much value from these cheaper players that are actually also having double game week fixtures, that it's not really even worth talking about the goalkeepers. You don't really need to naturally stretch towards Ramsdale or Ederson, but you know that these two assets have consistent value, right? Because this Arsenal and City team have posted fantastic expected goals conceded numbers, and maybe, as I said, Pope, it deserves some sort of shout here, but I think the way you should actually spend towards going for Newcastle is to go towards players like Botman, now that Reece James has opened up another FPL spot in our teams, because Botman is so much cheaper than Pope and also covers Pope in a very, very similar way. And then with someone like Newcastle, you have to kind of cover both Trippier and Almiron first before you even consider Pope, in my opinion. And that's kind of my thoughts on FPL. Whereas with Arsenal, you probably can get away with going for 2 midfielders, because I know a lot of people don't really like the philosophy of going for 3 attackers, for example, and that's kind of a really scary position to be in. So therefore Ramsdale and White and Gabriel are all at similar prices, and therefore there's not too much that you're missing out on by going for Ramsdale over White. So those are my kind of thoughts in FPL, and thank you guys so much for watching the video.